Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Q&A on Compose Basics. I'm your host, Alejandra Stamato. I'm the Developer Relations Engineer in Compose, focusing on text, state, and architecture. And today with me, I have my teammates who are...
Hello, I'm TJ. I focus on app architecture.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris. If you've been following the series so far, I might look familiar to you. And my focus is on migrating to Compose and Vue interop.
Hi everyone, my name is Jolanda Verhoef. I'm in the same team as the rest of these awesome people. And what I can answer questions on is testing, accessibility, layouts, and theming.
Awesome. So today we're going to be answering your questions we got from Twitter and other channels. But we encourage you to ask your own questions using the live stream chat on YouTube. And one last comment before we begin, we'll try to prioritize questions scoped to Compose Basics, leaving more advanced questions at the end. So don't be disappointed if we don't get to your sub-compose layout question in the time we have. Great, so that's it. Let's begin. I wanted to start off by asking a question, like a general question, which is, where is Compose right now, and what are some recent developments? Jolanda, maybe you know about this one.
Well, I can tell you that we're right now at Compose 1.3.0 RC01, which means that we're doing a release candidate version. And that means that we're getting ready for a new stable release. And the 1.3 release has a lot of awesome new features. The one that I'm looking forward to the most is the modifier changes, which you will actually not notice when you're using Compose, but it does give you like a lot more, eventually it will give you a lot more performance gains. And that's something that is, top of mind of us, is to create the most performant apps with Compose.
Awesome, sweet. What I like is that variable fonts is coming, so that's quite exciting, and a lot of text APIs are coming up too. So everyone, stay tuned for that. Great. So next question would be: is Compose ready for production?
I can take that one. So Compose 1.0 was made stable last year in July, and since then it's been ready for production. And it's our recommended framework for developing apps on Android. And Compose was also built with Vue interoperability in mind. So in scenarios where you do have to reach into the Vue system, there are APIs you can use to essentially talk between the two. So yes, it's ready for production, and it's definitely the future.
One thing that we've actually recently been doing, and we've been working on that for quite some time, is creating a sample app, which is quite large scale. It's called Now in Android. And that app actually uses 100% Compose. And that is a way for us as well, internally in Google, to try it out, see if it works at scale, see if it works when you have multiple modules, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's very true. And we have also a lot of other composable samples there, so make sure you check those ones out on GitHub. Great, so the next question is, maybe TJ, should we use list of T or immutable list of T for arguments to composables?
It's a great question. I think that you should use list of T. The only reason you'd want to use an immutable list is if you want to, you've found and you've checked and you've been able to find evidence that you do have performance issues where stability and the use of like an immutable list would provide you any benefits. There's a great blog post by my colleague Ben Trengrove. You should totally go check that out. But you really shouldn't try to pre-opt. You shouldn't try to do anything that would be in the course of premature optimization. So for your composables, use a simple list, unless there's evidence that you do have a performance hiccup or a bottleneck that would encourage you or cause you to go check for things that would fix that issue. So to start out with, just use a simple list.
Awesome, thank you. Great, so next question is, doesn't data binding library support writing declarative code, and should we just use that with views instead of Compose? Good question. Maybe Jolanda?
Yeah, I like that question because indeed, like using data binding, you will already get some declarative features. So that's great. However, Compose gives you much more than just that. So even though within the Vue system, you can basically get to a point where you do, unidirectional data flow, where you create this kind of declarative approach. I wouldn't say that that's the only thing that Compose brings. So one other benefit that Compose has is it's written completely in Kotlin, right? And that means that when you're writing your codes and when you're implementing your design, you actually write in the same kind of code that you write for your presenters or your view models. And that helps with creating that kind of cohesive classes, like your UI code lives super close to your business logic, and all of that feature code will all live in the same package in your system. So that's one of the things why Compose helps you to create better and more concise code.
I just
Anyone
want to
else
add to
want
that.
to?
Yeah, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? If you data binding is specific to views, so you can definitely still use that alongside with Compose. But Compose is definitely the future. So, if you kind of were choosing between the two, definitely I would choose Compose for the reasons Jolanda mentioned.
Sweet. Awesome. We love Compose, as you can tell, probably. Great. So you mentioned that Composable should be free of side effects. But what if I want a button to have a side effect, for example, triggering analytic events? Maybe Chris?
Yes. Yeah. So there are a couple of side effect APIs that you can use. So launch effect is one of them. So launch effect, you specify some keys that would get executed, or rather, if the keys change, this launch effect would get recomposed, and then you can perform, a side effect action like an analytics event. And then there is also a disposable effect. So if you need to listen to the dispose callback, for example, if you're adding a listener to perhaps the lifecycle, then or rather an observer to the lifecycle, you can add it in the disposable effect, and in the dispose call, you can remove it. So those are two options for you for performing side effects.
Sweet. Anyone else want to add to that? I think you covered it pretty well. Great. We're getting a lot of questions from our stream, so let's go to those ones. Is the right time to migrate existing Excel? Is it the right time to migrate, Chris? Is it?
Very good question. So I think, if you're just starting out with Compose, I recommend starting out with like really simple screens because it gives you a way to kind of try out Compose, and then it's also like low hanging fruit. It's really easy to migrate these simple screens to Compose, and I would definitely start off there. You can also use Compose for new features. As I mentioned, Compose works with views, so you can kind of intermix the two. But moving on to kind of existing features, right? Existing code, and I guess your existing XML files, I would definitely prioritize migrating those, as Compose allows you to essentially avoid an entire set of bugs from state synchronization, which is something I covered in the first episode of the series. So yes, I think it's definitely the right time, and I would do this process incrementally. Make sure to rely on UI testing so that you're not introducing regressions as you're migrating.
Good advice. Testing, Yolanda's favorite topic.
Yes. I do want to do a little pitch here. Keep watching. We have a big conference coming up, as you all might know, and there's some very interesting topics around migration as well. So that will help you give that answer on how exactly to migrate. And if this is the right time, well, basically we're saying any new app you write right now, every new feature, every new screen, new things, definitely go and research Compose. And that's probably where you want to start.
It's great you said that, because it's a perfect way to the next question. So we have all of this. Then what are the benefits of using Compose?
I can take this one. If you watched the video series that Chris put out, you notice that he kept mentioning a certain word, that Compose is our new declarative UI toolkit. I think if you wanted to summarize all the benefits of Compose, it's really in that sentence, in that phrase, declarative. what Compose lets you do and helps you eliminate a whole set of bugs is you just have to say what your UI looks like. You don't have to like poke around, say like, what is the state of my view? You don't have to go check query its state and modify it. You just say, this is what my view ought to look like. And Compose just does it all for you. So if I was going to say like, and then all the remaining benefits that you can list out, all just kind of like go out from that general maxim. Compose is a declarative UI toolkit. The main benefit of Compose is you just get to say what your view looks like, and Compose does the rest. It's amazing. It's one of those things that you start doing it, you get used to it, and then you start remember how you used to do it before, and you're like, how did I do it this old way for so long? If to summarize or to answer your question more succinctly, the benefits of using Compose is that Compose is declarative.
Anyone wants to add to that? Beautifully put. I love it. Once you change the chip, it really does make sense. And you kind of are like, where have you been all my life? But yeah, everybody.
I also want to shout out tooling, right? With previews and tooling built into Android Studio, the development process and the iteration cycle is much faster. So you can essentially build components, and it allows you to build a library of components really easily due to the nature of how easy it is to make composable functions and UI components. So it's really easy to kind of build these these reusable components without necessarily deploying to the app to an emulator or device. So I feel like that process of like developing is just made much faster.
It's more agile, and you feel like there is less scaffold to get like the simplest things done. Like lazy list, it's like the perfect example, right? Like in a few lines of code, you get your list and you can test it, and you don't have to remember like the adapter and the view holder and the whole. I feel like that's also a strength that it has, among others.
Did anyone already say Kotlin?
Ooh.
Like, it's all written in Kotlin, and for me that's like a game changer, because instead of having to switch every time between that kind of XML, and then when I go to the rest of my application, it's all Kotlin. It like going back and forth, it's just quite difficult. And what I love is we can basically just say, like, we can use an if-else statement, we can use a for loop, all just in our UI code. And that is something that I always struggled with in XML. Like, what if you want to show some things only in certain scenarios? That was always quite hard, and now it's just a simple if statement. And I think one thing that I particularly like when I'm building things with Compose is how easy it is to create layouts that have certain slots in them. So an example is like the top app bar that has a slot for the title and then a slot for the actions and a slot for the navigation icon. Creating those kind of reusable layouts is something I try to do a lot of times with XML, and I always really struggled with it. Just to be like as if it never was any different, right? And that's really great.
Yeah. We could like keep on like kind of saying why Compose is great, but we need to move on to the next one. Yeah, cool. So performance. Look, performance has been a conversation. Performance of native views versus Compose. What can we say?
We can say a lot. I know that it is a topic that is top of mind of us, so we're doing a lot of investigations in the area. There is a lot of resources on performance. I think one thing that is super important to call out is that when you run your app in debug mode, so when you run it in an emulator or you run it directly from Android Studio on your device, that will make it look quite slow. So the first thing you might think is that your app, written in Compose, behaves much worse. But there is a very technical reason why that's the case. There's a blog post about like why exactly and all the reasons for it. But one thing that's important is that whenever you're like actually looking at the performance of your app, you look at the release version of your app. And then you use tools like R8 to kind of do optimizations while you compile your app. There are some things in Compose where, performance can be an issue. But we have like a lot of guidance on of those just perform, and most of the times it actually does. So as long as you don't see any performance issues, then you're fine. And then whenever you see issues, that's the moment where you want to inspect what's going on. And we have a bunch of tooling, and we have guidance on how you can use that tooling to figure out, what could be causing a specific hiccup in your code or in your app. And we have that tooling. If you inspect with that tooling, you can actually start iterating on it. I think I want to call out one more thing that I always hear my colleague Ben in the back of my mind when I talk about performance, and not Ben Verhoef, but Ben Weiss, who's like, okay, you need to talk about baseline profiles.
Yes.
So there is a feature called baseline profiles. Google it. Whenever you really want to get to releasing your app, that's going to make your app speed up tremendously.
Yes, baseline profiles. Anyone else wants to talk about performance? We have resources. We have the right people on Twitter. We have a lot of things. So just a matter of looking them up. Okay, next question is, I like it. I do not see the use of Fragments in any Compose code lab. And do we not need Fragment when we use Compose? Now, I can take up this one just a little bit before leading to Chris, but I believe that Sunflower does have Fragments, as it is the use case of interop, like the use case. And also, I would say that you do not need Fragments anymore in the Compose world. But probably you want to take out this one. Yes, I'm not gonna try to do a better job there.
No, that was pretty good. Thanks for calling out Sunflower. It is our sample app for migrating an existing Vue-based app to Compose. If you take the, I forget the title, like Migrating to Compose Code Lab, it's exactly that. You migrate the Sunflower app, which is Fragment, which uses Fragment and navigation component to Compose. So I think if you are starting out with a new app, you definitely don't need to use Fragments. You can go 100% Compose. Now, there might be some edge cases where maybe you're using a third-party library that uses Fragments and you have to bring it into Compose. You can do that as well using the Android view binding composable function. So if you're Compose, and this is the reason, to answer the second part of your question, this is the reason why a lot of the Compose code labs don't have Fragments, because they're written with starting with Compose 100% in mind. Now, if you have an existing Vue-based app that uses Fragments, then you would definitely have to think about the migration strategy for how to get your Fragment-based app, Fragment and Vue-based app to Compose. And one strategy is to essentially first replace all of the contents of the fragment to be composed. So you're still using navigation component, you're still using Fragments, and once all of the contents of your fragment are in Compose, then you can replace your Fragments with essentially a top-level composable function, and then use navigation compose to then drive the different routes in your app. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. I think that's more than covered, Grace. Thank you so much. Great. So the next question is Compose tied closely to the AGP version? Now, I believe that what's tied closely to the AGP version is Android Studio, and Compose doesn't necessarily. And what Compose is tied to might be the minimum SDK, the target SDK that you use. And that happens with all of the Android X libraries. Anyone wants to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add something else. So there's also the Compose compiler version. So the Android Gradle plugin, right, so if you're looking at a Gradle script, whether it's in Groovy or whether it's in Kotlin, anytime you have that Android block configuration, that's what the Android Gradle plugin does. The entry point for Compose, Compose has its own compiler plugin. Now, there might be certain things that the Compose compiler plugin takes advantage of from the Gradle plugin and vice versa, but you should think of them as two separate things. The Android Gradle plugin helps you configure your Android Gradle projects. The Compose compiler plugin compiles your composable functions, so they're distinct.
Sweet. Yes.
One thing that I would like to add to that, because I think TJ, you mentioned it very correctly. I just want to add that recently we actually made the decision to let the compiler have its own release cycle. So now we do much quicker updates of the Compose compiler. And the one thing it is linked to is the Kotlin version. So now what you can do is whenever you upgrade Kotlin to a newer version, you can update the Compose compiler with it, and those two will then play nicely together. And then the rest of the Compose libraries actually works differently. So those are not linked to each other anymore.
Yes, more independence for the win. That's it. Cool, great. Okay, so we have a next question is, why would we have constraint layouts in Compose? I mean, we can use other things and create the same UI, and then still, why are we providing constraint layout separately?
Oh, can I take this one?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Okay. I think, so the short answer is sometimes it works, it's more readable. I think that's the short answer. The long answer is yes, you can do everything with nested rows and columns if you want to. But as you know from when you were using constraint layout in the view world, the reason why we used constraint layout was to prevent that deep nesting of those rows and those columns, right? So in the view system, that actually led to performance issues. In Compose, it doesn't per se, but still, if you have that, like, I don't know, 8 layers deep nesting of columns and rows just to get your layout to behave the way you want it to, that's not very readable. So the constraint layout library exists basically to make it easier for you to kind of explain how you want certain elements of your UI to be constrained towards each other, right? So I would say if you decide whether or not you want to use it, when you notice that you have very complicated setup of constraints, try it with constraint layout, and probably you'll see that then things are easier to set up and more readable as it is.
Yeah. I also just want to add to that. There are also use cases for constraint layout that would be very difficult, not impossible, but really difficult to do with just rows and columns. For example, constraint layouts have the concepts of barriers, right? Especially when you're dealing with text fields and where and you use those text fields in different languages. For example, a phrase may be very short in English and it may be a bit longer in another language, right? And constraint layout has the concept of a barrier so some of these you can kind of emulate or create or come up with your own heuristic for showing rows so they don't cross a barrier, but you could also do it very simply with constraint layout. In other words, the concept or the ideology behind constraint layout, it's still valid, it still has use in a Compose world. Now, for maybe a vast majority of cases, you may opt not to use it, but there will be some cases where the constraint layout and how it works and its mental model are still very, very powerful concepts, and it may just be easier to use a constraint layout. So in other words, it's just a matter of picking the right tool for the right job.
Great, sweet. I like that. There is actually a follow-up question, and would be that and Jolanda, you kind of mentioned that already. If the nesting, it will be the nesting problem for rendering time in Compose.
Wait, what is the question?
If you have multiple nesting of composables, like remember how in build system it would be a problem. Is in Compose a problem too?
In principle, no, because creating a composable is actually really, really low lift, so it doesn't take a lot of time to create such a composable. So that kind of nesting in general isn't where your performance will actually get hurt.
Sweet, cool. That's very clear. Cool, thank you. Great. So the next question is, should we use the single activity all the way or not?
I can. Oh.
Yes,
maybe
TJ.
TJ.
I'm sorry. It's because in the last Q&A, I was in the architectural one. We had Yeet with Manu and stuff, and this question came up. And I think we said that in a greenfield app, you're creating a brand new app, we would strongly advise you to go single activity. Now, again, we did mention that there were a few cases, for example, if you had to do picture-in-picture and stuff that you may opt to have a separate activity. But please use a single activity, especially with Compose and Navigation Compose. It will make your life easier. At least I think. I'm going to defer to Chris to add anything he wants to say, but I'm team single activity.
No, I'm on the same team, and I think the question, or the part of the question where it says all the way or not, I feel like there are to what you said about picture-in-picture. Perhaps there are other features you want to expose to other apps, like if you have an intent filter, that might be a valid use case for creating another activity. But for the entry point into your app, when someone clicks your app, I think that should definitely be a single activity.
Brilliant, perfect. I guess developers really want to know, should we do this or should we not do this? But hopefully that clarifies. Great. Maybe Chris, at what point should I start to learn Compose in my Android development journey? I'm a beginner with Android development. Maybe Jolanda too, you can pick.
Yeah, I can give some give an answer on this. So obviously there's this Mad Skills. You can check it out, watch it, learn the basics of Compose. There's also, if you want to learn Compose in a group, there's also Compose Camp happening in session around the world. I think in the description of this video, you can find a link for that. And then we have a bunch of code labs you can take also at your own pace. If you want to explore different parts of Compose and have a little bit more hands-on experience with that. Yeah, is there anything I'm missing, Jolanda?
I think you're giving a good set of resources of where you can start. I think in the question I see that, Noel, you're a beginner with Android development. In that case, I would definitely recommend a course we have called Android Basics with Compose, or ABC course, which is teaching you the beginnings of not only Compose, but of Android development as a whole. So that is basically your way into Android development. And then for the UI, you would be using Compose. In general, what we say is for people that are new to Android development and new to learning how to build Android apps, we would suggest that you start by learning Compose. So that's the first kind of step. And eventually you will have to learn about the view system as well, because most of the apps that are currently in production will be running code from the view system, right? So you will have to know about it. But like looking forward, we're investing in Compose. That's where that is the future. So that's the one that you want to get the most expertise in to start with.
Perfect, brilliant. Awesome, so next up we have, is there a code lab for testing UI test or UI tests in Compose? Thanks.
Well, as the testing point of contact, I can take this one. Yes, we have a code lab for testing. It is part of our Compose course. You can Google for probably Compose testing code lab should help you find it. It is helping you to write a UI test and a semantic UI test. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it also does a quick screenshot test, which is more of a visual test of like, okay, are your pixels doing what you want? I think that is the short answer to your question. I can talk a lot more about testing, but I would suggest give it a week or so, and maybe there will be some guidance coming out on how to write tests for Compose.
Maybe we have to wait and see. Cool, great. So my question is, what is the use of experimental annotations? And I know that this question comes up because a lot of the APIs that are new, obviously, are annotated with experimental material tree, experimental material, experimental text, experimental. My way of understanding this is some teams are like literally that, putting out there like new APIs, they annotate it with experimental, they start gathering feedback, seeing how these impacts the rest of the ecosystem. Some API surfaces might be bound to change eventually, expand or be modified depending on how this performs, or how this performs in the sense of not performance, but how developers are finding the usage of it. So it might mean that it may change, but it doesn't mean that it's unstable or that it's just there, well, just like trying out stuff to see if it blows up or not. So that's my understanding. I know it's the case for a lot of APIs that we have, including collect as state with lifecycle and the like hyphenation APIs in text. So yeah, that's essentially it. It's like safe to use, but it still might be better than implementing your own version of whatever the library is doing because it's just there. It just means that by updating it to the next version, maybe you have a breaking change or you have to adapt a little thing or something might change. Anyone wants to add something that I'm missing?
Yeah, I think it's really just our way of communicating like, hey, this might change. So if you are okay with that, with a future version, then explicitly opt in for this annotation. Whereas if you think, okay, this is a part of the code that I don't want any breaking change coming up, so like then you might opt out for that. So it's really just a communication method for explicitly saying, okay, this can change in the future based on feedback from developers, right?
Yeah, and I think a last thing to add there, in addition, is that the problem with not using the experimental notation is that we can actually not make changes anymore. So this is like a contract we're bound to as Compose, and it has to do with like semantic versioning of the library. So once you have a function, a method that is not using that experimental annotation, then we are not allowed to change that API contract. That will be considered a breaking change, and we have to do a huge update of Compose instead of doing an incremental update. And we want the developers to be able to update their apps safely without being scared that their upgrade will actually break something. So what we try to do is we try to limit those changes to those experimental APIs, and then when we have an experimental method, we just leave it in there for a couple of releases, make sure that indeed everyone is using it as is. And before each bigger release, we do go through all of those experimental APIs and see if they still should be experimental. And that means that when you upgrade, for example, from 1.2 to eventually 1.3, everything should just work. And if there's any breaking changes, not API-wise, but behavior-wise, we will call them out in the release notes and we will be very explicit about it.
Yeah, and one more thing I want to add to that is that also when you say experimental, it's not, I don't want you to like read experimental and think that this is like, this won't work or it's inefficient or anything. That's not what the experimental API is. Like Jolanda was saying, it's a contract. Any experimental API, the entire point with it being experimental is we're trying to find the quickest path to stable for this API. But we do need to experiment with it and see how people use it and get feedback on it to see, like, for example, can this API be improved in a better way? Are there more ergonomic ways this API can be exposed? So it's not experimental to say like, it's unstable, it could break, it's inefficient. No, it's saying like, hey, we have this API, we want to get this API to a final state, but we do need to know how people use it, and we do need to get more feedback on it, and then find a path to stable for it.
Great. I think we all contributed to that one, so hopefully it's clear. Awesome, great. So next question is, maybe we can, I guess this is related to some of the things we've said before. What is the proper process of migrating from XML project to Compose?
Okay, so in an XML project, so I think a good strategy for this is to, since this is an existing app, right, you can take inventory of like the different screens you have on your application and find, components that are reused throughout different screens. So for example, maybe there's a button that, is rendered and styled in a very standard way. Maybe there's an alert you're displaying, an in-app notification. So essentially find these like reusable components and build that component library in Compose. Separate package or separate module. And then what I would do is, if we're just isolating this to existing features, I mentioned this earlier, where you can start, with low hanging fruit. So try to find simple screens that you can improve quickly with, or easily with Compose. So find those simple screens, and then for the more complex screens, again, it's really important to do this migration incrementally, really similar to adopting any new technology, right? Where you don't want to replace everything all at once because there is definitely some risk in that. So a strategy you can do is called the bottom up approach of migrating, where you take a subtree in your UI hierarchy and replace that into Compose. So, one example would be maybe you have a really complex recycler view with different item types. You can maybe migrate one item at a time to Compose and essentially work your way up the tree, right? And get to a point where you can replace recycler view with lazy column or lazy row. And, essentially, again, I think the key word here is incremental, right? You want to do this slowly so that you're not introducing regressions to your existing app.
Sweet, awesome. I think right. Yeah, it was a great answer. Very, very complete. Thank you. So our next question is: while building more complex UI, which one is suitable for that, Compose or XML? Now, complex is relative, right? Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, I think we can keep this one short. As we say, like for new features, for new screens, use Compose. Even for complex UI, they're both equally powerful. If there's anything that Compose isn't able to do, there is interop options to kind of refer back to the view world. For example, there it could be that you're using a certain library that provides you with a piece of UI, and that library didn't use Compose yet. So there are situations where you want to revert back to views, but in general, we would be recommending Compose here.
Brilliant. Perfect. The future is bright ahead. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I thought someone wanted to contribute to that one. So if no one wants to, the next question is, thanks for Compose. I would like to have a tutorial and a better documentation on custom lazy layout creation. Is there anything planned?
Well, in general, we cannot say anything about future work. As far as I know, we don't have any current in-depth guidance on lazy layouts or on custom lazy layouts. We have a lot about lazy in general. I know that in the last I/O, if I'm not mistaken, we had a talk on lazy in general. I'm not sure into how much detail that went into custom lazy layouts, but I'd definitely give that a go. And other than that, good feedback. And if we really are missing that, then I'm pretty sure we should start looking into that.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yes, we can skip to that. Next one. How long is accompanist supposed to remain necessary? Accompanist. If everyone doesn't know what accompanist is, it's a collection of libraries that we can add to a Compose application that would help fill in some gaps that we don't have implemented in Android X, but we can add accompanist and those will do the job for us.
I can take this one. How long is this supposed to remain necessary? Well, so that again, there's a great blog post that outlines what accompanist is and what it exists for. And the entire point is, at some point, is we would like everything that accompanist provides to be upstreamed and provided in the official, in the Android X Compose libraries. However, going back to the same thing we're talking about with experimental APIs and what we have to gather feedback on some of these things before we can actually promote them to stable. Accompanist lets us do things that will be really, really, really hard to do in Android X. So when you say how long is this supposed to remain necessary, as long as our roadmap, and we do have a Compose roadmap, right? As long as we start pulling those things in accompanist back into Android X Foundation, accompanist will still be available. So if you're trying to figure out how long it will still exist, please take a look at the Compose roadmap. That gives you an idea of what we're planning to do and when we hope to have that by. Now, That's not to say that as we keep pulling things out of our companies into the Android X artifacts, doesn't mean that there might be other things that we may not want to add to our companies. So to answer your question is, a companies will remain necessary for as long as it remains necessary, which is kind of like an interesting non-answer. But to try to answer your question, that's the entire point of a company is to let us experiment with things that we would like to bring into Android X, and then we'll upstream it into Android X as soon as we can. So our companies will be there till we can actually do that.
Yeah, and I also want to emphasize that point about upstreaming to Android X and official, Jetpack library, because I think that's a key point, right? Because when it does get upstreamed, the migration process should be, fairly simple, because it should use the same APIs, and I think that's what makes it kind of it reduces the risk, right? Where we're not going to introduce like a completely different API from what's in Compass.
Or at least if the path it's a little bit complex, it's documented, properly documented in the library. So don't worry, that will be covered for you. Cool, great. So our next question is there emoji to support for Compose? This one is like a very quick one. No, there ain't. There is a bug opened for that in which you can go and plus go and then vote it up. So we go and put more priority into it if you're interested in support for emoji too. Brilliant, great. That was a quick one. Next up, what is a good practice for passing around objects to the children composables? Presently, using local composition for accessing data for deeply nested views. A very architectural question.
I can go for this. So I guess, so in architecture documentation, when we go about the UI layer, we'll talk about the UI layer. We identified two kinds of logic that may exist in your UI. We talked about UI logic, we talk about business logic. And we mentioned that for both of these kinds of logic, you have stakeholders, that can do this for you. So you could have, for a UI logic stakeholder, for example, you could think of drawer state or snack bar host state for showing a snack bar. And for business logic, this is typically your view model. Now, we say like composables, so you should pass everything a composable should have everything it needs passed to it. So if you have, when you say deeply nested, I'm assuming that your nesting level is maybe 2 or 3 levels deep. I think if you're finding yourself passing things to composables that 2-3 nested levels deep, you have to start asking yourself, is there a better thing that I can pull this logic into that can make this composable a little more self-sufficient? For example, I think the most common scenario that brings up nested UIs is if you're using a pager. If you want to pass things down the tree, you can use a composition local, but I do want you to be a little scrutinize that a little bit more, because a composition local is not a global variable, but in other words, once you have a composition local, almost anything else can read that composition local. And the use cases for that are few and far between. A fantastic use case for a composition local, for example, is a material. There's a material theme that is shared across your entire app. This is a scope that a composition local will be great for. If you're just using it to pass things down the tree, I would ask you to rethink your architecture a little bit, see if you can pull that into a stakeholder, whether it's UI logic or business logic, because the use cases for a composition local are usually for really niche things like that. For example, a theme or things that kind of affect your app on a global scale. I would shy away from using it as this kind of arbitrary way of passing things down the tree. There are other management or architectural patterns you can use to better mitigate and manage state for nodes within Compose. So please look at the UI layer doc, and don't use composition local as this. Don't let that be your first go-to step. I don't want you to think I need to pass something down the tree, I'm going to use a composition local. No, please think about other architectural things you could do. Again, look into stakeholders, whether it's for UI logic or business logic.
Brilliant. I love that question and that answer. Okay, I think we don't have that much time, but we have a ton of questions. So let's speed up and give a little ping pong of answers. Okay, how much more Compose content we can foresee in the future. I like the cadence of math skills and looking forward to more. Will there be more, Chris?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. And yes, so the short answer is there will be more. Obviously, this is like our first series on like the basics of Compose, but you can expect, I don't know, want to keep this vague, but you can expect a lot more content, deep diving into specific areas of Compose. And
Perfect.
what would you like to see as well? Shoot us a message. We're keen to hear what you'd like to see in our future math skills.
Awesome. Love it. Great. Next up, Compose is great. Do you plan on having more documentation on UI testing? Yellow.
Well, it says unit testing, and unit testing is, of course, much broader than just Compose. In Compose, we generally do UI testing, right, which can be on the unit level. So in Compose, you can test just tiny composables if you want to. We have guidance on that. If anything's missing, please reach out, shout what is missing. And there is a DroidCon Berlin talk that I did recently together with my colleague Jose, which goes into a bit more detail of the types of tests. So that could be interesting to look up. Just pitching myself here for a second.
No, please do, because I was there for that talk, and that talk is legit gold. Great. So next up, why is live data deprecated in Compose? It isn't, right? Yes.
Live data is, well, so there's like two things in there. Live data is not deprecated, right? Live data is what we recommend for, especially if you're using the Java programming language. However, if you're using Compose, again, there's a doc we just put out recently, I think just this week, which is the name of the doc is UI state production. And we give you a really, really nice table for what API we recommend for exposing state to your composables. And for when you're using Compose, because the Compose is declarative and it's important to be able to actually like just tell the composable what has changed and tell the composable what has changed, we recommend two things. We recommend stateflow or compose state. The interesting thing is, if you do use stateflow, when you're reading that stateflow in Compose, you still have to convert it to compose state. Compose state is the only state Compose can read. So it really doesn't even matter if you're using live data. So if you use live data, for example, if your stakeholder was exposing live data, you would need to convert that live data to compose state. In other words, whether you're using a stateflow or live data, regardless, if you're going to consume that in Compose, you're still going to have to convert it to compose state. So live data is not deprecated, period, and it's also not deprecated in Compose.
Yes. So they wanted us to say this, though. Like, they wanted to ask that question. Great. Well, cool. Next up, will there be something equivalent to nested scrolling in Compose?
We have nested scrolling in Compose, don't we? I'm
at the beginning,
checking myself now, but
I believe that at the beginning it used to be a thing from the previous first version of Compose, and this was a fixed bug that was fixed. And then there is a sample in JetChat of a fragment interrupting with a lazy column with the scroll connection.
Yeah.
The one thing, wait, I think I know what Tarek is pointing at. I know what you cannot do, and I've actually had this problem before as well, is you cannot say, okay, let's make a scrollable column and then inside put other scrollable columns. So you cannot nest something that is scrollable on the same axis. And one thing where that can be a problem is, for example, imagine that you have a homepage which has first a grid, so first section is a grid, and then you have a section which is just a normal column, like a lazy column, and then you have a section which is something else. There you get into trouble, right? Because you cannot nest lazy vertical scrolling things in each other. That is something we do have in our backlog. We do know about it. So far, we've been thinking about just using custom, just laying everything out in a custom way. So you can get away with that. But in the future, we are thinking about how can we make that API smoother, basically. Yeah.
Also, there is a talk on lazy layouts from the Droidcon Berlin as well, which tells you how this is a anti-practice, a bad practice, and that and many other tips to like kind of not basically put your lazy columns in or lazy layouts in a bad position performance-wise. Sweet. Next up, where to check for the latest version of Compose, like what's new?
We have release notes for each release. So if you go to basically the reference docs for the different packages, each package will have basically per release, it will have listed what changed. And for the bigger stable releases, it will have an overview of everything that changed between the previous one and the current one. And we often also do a blog post when we do stable releases.
TJ wanted to add something to it?
And I was going to say exactly the same thing she said. My default, the thing I do is I just do Android X releases or Compose releases, and the first results is usually developer.android.com. And like Jolanda was saying, there's great release notes that have as much detail as you could possibly need.
Awesome. Great. Yes. Brilliant. Next up, can we add sticky headers to lazy vertical grid?
No.
Look, either you can or you can't.
No, we have an experimental API for sticky headers for lazy column, but that API needs some love before it can be moved to lazy vertical grids. So I mean, there might I can imagine that at some point a third-party library could pop up that does that, but as far as I know right now, no.
Also, if you're really adventurous, like you can add, it does require a bit of work, but the APIs, especially if you do if you monitor the scroll state, there's ways you can create a sticky header. I mean, I say this because I've done it myself. It's a bit involved, but it's not impossible to do it right now. It just requires a bit more work. But as far as like an official API goes, like Jolanda says, the lazy column one is experimental. We're still gathering feedback before we can extend it to lazy grid.
Sweet. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Great. Next up. Scaffold layout is necessary to show up and fab and bottom sheet?
I wouldn't say it's like necessary, but it makes your life much easier because the scaffold, was designed to help you kind of lay out these common material patterns, right? With a top app bar, bottom navigation, floating action button, snack bar, right? If you're displaying a notification. So definitely, it's not necessary, but it'll make your life much, much easier.
Perfect. I love that answer, by the way. Great. So I think we're running low on time. I think this will be our last question. Do you have any tips on what to look out for in order to minimize unnecessary recompositions and ensure as many composables are skippable as possible? Now, we've had this conversation a few days back. Anyone who wants to take up this one?
I can try. So we have like an excellent documentation page for everything diving into performance. There's also a Medium article written by Ben on this subject. But a couple of tools that come to mind, right, are the competition counter. Like that's an excellent tool. Maybe you see like there is a performance issue in the app while running it in mode.
I think all of us are looking a little bit disturbed because we think there might be something with your microphone.
Yeah.
You're sounding a little bit muted. Did you put your hand on the microphone, Chris?
I did not.
Oh, then you're sounding crispy now. Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure what you missed from what I was saying, but
yeah, everything. Undo everything again, please.
Okay, so let me start from the beginning then. So I was saying that there's an excellent documentation page on performance that you can look into. I think Jolanda brought this up earlier, that helps you sort of identify different things you can do to profile your application, find performance issues. Things that come to mind are like the recomposition counter on Android Studio. So if you do find maybe there is a non-performant portion of your app while running it in release mode, that's a tool you can use. Let's see. Oh yeah, and I also mentioned Ben Trengrove has some excellent posts talking about performance specifically that deep dives into these concepts of stability, skippable and skippable, and what's the other one? Restartable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, TJ.
Oh, thanks. I was also going to say that, again, you really do want to be wary about optimizing prematurely, right? So I was going to say, like, just keep a mental checklist, right? So if you're working with Compose, first run it with R8 to run it in production mode. Check that performance is not an issue. Now, if performance is an issue, going back to what Chris said, like the latest Android Studio has tools for like the recomposition counter and stuff. So you really, 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 really want to make sure there's an issue before you start trying to like, appending and pulling things out of the roots, trying to look for something that might not be there. So there isn't an issue till there is one. And if there is one, there are a couple of steps you can use to debug that, well laid out in Ben's blog post. But the last thing we really, really want you to think about is if you're writing any composable and start thinking like, oh, is this skippable yet? Oh, is this all that? That's not what Compose, you're not, it's supposed to be declarative, threat-free. So there isn't a problem until there's a problem. And if there's a problem, there's steps you can take to start figuring out what those problems are, and then you know what remedy to apply to that point. Sorry, going back to Jolanda.
I think she's frozen.
I just wanted to add, I watched Ben's talk on this and kind of my knowledge. Oh, was I frozen? Let me know if you can hear me.
Ouch. Yes.
You could start
We can
again.
hear
We can hear now.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna quickly call out derived state of is an interesting one to look into. I would say take a look at if you have a lot of state reads. So if you have, for example, animation going on, an animation that updates a value, that is a value that can cause a lot of recompositions. And when you use that value in one of your modifiers, that can cause performance issues, because if that happens on every single frame it updates and causes a recomposition, that can get really slow. So there is that's one thing to keep an eye out on. And I would say watch Ben's talk if you want to learn more.
And keep an eye out for ADS. There's going to be a bunch of stuff about this ADS, and you get even more in-depth answers to that question.
Yes, ADS is coming and a lot of stuff is coming. So keep an eye out. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for both your questions and your answers. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have more questions or we couldn't get to yours because there's a lot of more questions that we couldn't get to today, please make sure to find us on Twitter and we'll be happy to help you out. Also, as a reminder, if you are new to Compose and would like to learn more about Compose in a group, Compose Camp is happening in sessions around the world. So please make sure to check out that on the link in the description of this video. But thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, DJ. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Yolo. And we'll see you next time. Bye.